encontro. Este evento está sendo gravado. Hoje temos legendas e interpretação disponíveis. Se as legendas ainda não apareceram em sua tela, clique em Legendas ou CC abaixo para ativá-las. Também temos acesso para a interpretação. Pode clicar na imagem do globo abaixo para acessar a interpretação em português. Os microfones e câmeras de vocês ficarão desligados por enquanto. Durante o programa, vocês podem podem fazer perguntas na caixa das perguntas aqui embaixo. Fica na vantagem para usar o caixa do chat entre vocês, mas lembre-se de usar, por favor, a caixa das perguntas para direcionar as perguntas aos palestrantes. Agora, para a nossa abertura, quero passar a palavra para o presidente da Associação de Juízes Federais, a JUF, o senhor presidente Eduardo André.
Obrigado, Kevin. Boa tarde a todos e todas. Cumprimento e agradeço ao Consulado dos Estados Unidos no Rio de Janeiro, na pessoa de seu representante, por esse evento tão relevante no qual se discute a participação das mulheres no Poder Judiciário, todas as conquistas e desafios nesse caminho. Cumprimento ainda a professora Sally Kenney e os magistrados federais, que muitos nos honram com a sua presença e representação na nossa carreira aqui hoje, Jane Reis e Roger Halpe Rios. Ambos são juízes e professores que elevam a reflexão da magistratura nessa temática. Para a JUF, esse evento é de grande importância. Há 4 anos, a JUF instituiu a sua comissão, a JUF Mulheres, e tem realizado extensas pesquisas sobre a participação das mulheres na magistratura, as dificuldades e as possibilidades de mudança de cenário. Já elaboramos 2 notas técnicas sobre esse tema. Temos mais de 100 colegas em grupos de debates, fizemos 3 publicações de livro e vamos seguir em frente com esse trabalho. Muitas reflexões construtivas para a magistratura como um todo têm saído da JUF Mulheres. A estrada ainda é longa, mas o que foi construído até aqui é alvissareiro. Então, gostaria de agradecer a inclusão da nossa entidade no evento e desejar um ótimo debate, fazendo um agradecimento especial às minhas 2 grandes colegas, Tânia Maria Ruster e Clara Mota Pimenta. Boa tarde a todos. Obrigado.
Obrigado, senhor presidente. Hoje agradecemos de forma especial a Associação de Juízes Federais, a JUF, e a JUF Mulheres, e estendemos nosso especial agradecimento ao juíza e também professora da UERJ, doutora Jane Reis, e ao também professor e desembargador, Dr. Roger Halpe Rios, por nos ajudarem a debater esse assunto de extrema relevância para nossas sociedades. Obrigado pela colaboração e realização deste evento. É um prazer estarmos aqui com vocês hoje. Este é um mês muito importante para nosso país e um marco para muitas sociedades. Celebramos o mês da história das mulheres, Women's History Month, em honorado tantas vitórias de mulheres extraordinárias, corajosas que vêm avançando no campo de direito das mulheres, por uma sociedade mais igualitária e justa para todos. Longas lutas em diversas frentes inspiram as mulheres americanas a ocuparem espaços que tradicionalmente são ocupados só por homens. E hoje, aqui falaremos sobre essas questões e as posições de liderança em nossos sistemas judiciários. Em meu país, os cargos que compõem o sistema judiciário, sejam eles de advogados, escriturários, paralegais, juízes e outros trabalhadores judiciais, historicamente têm sido em grande parte ocupados por homens. Somente em 1869, Arabel Mansfield se tornou a primeira advogada do nosso país. E em 1928, Genevieve Rose Klein tornou-se a primeira mulher nomeada para uma corte federal nos Estados Unidos. Desde então, mais e mais mulheres se juntaram à força de trabalho no nosso sistema jurídico, mas sabemos que o campo ainda é amplamente dominado por homens. Hoje, 9 juízes atuam na Suprema Corte, sendo que apenas 3 desses juízes são mulheres. Sandra Day O'Connor fez história como a primeira mulher na Suprema Corte em 1981. Ela serviu até sua aposentadoria em 2006. Outras mulheres igualmente importantes e corajosas seguiram essa trajetória, dentre elas Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, que acabou tornando-se um ícone mundial, inspirando tantas meninas, mulheres e homens também. Hoje, mais do que nunca, mulheres frequentam a Faculdade de Direito nos Estados Unidos. Na verdade, pelo terceiro ano consecutivo em meu país, as mulheres superam os homens nas salas de aula das faculdades de Direito. Eu imagino que dinâmica semelhante ocorra também no Brasil. Precisamos sempre lembrar que as decisões judiciais em todos os níveis têm impacto importante sobre a política, leis e realmente o funcionamento da economia e da vida de todos os cidadãos. Essas decisões judiciais fazem julgamentos sobre constitucionalidade, fraude, responsabilidade, discriminação e muito mais. Ter mais mulheres desempenhando essas funções ajuda a construir a inclusão, um sistema com transparência e representação das pessoas que o sistema judicial defende, fortalecendo a democracia. O afluxo de mulheres atualmente na Faculdade de Direito pode sinalizar que uma representação mais justa das mulheres no Judiciário está a caminho no futuro. E precisamos falar sobre isso. E por isso, estamos felizes por contar hoje com a presença da cientista política, a professora doutora Sally Kenney. Doutora Kenney formou-se em ciência política pela Universidade do Iowa e completou seu mestrado em política, filosofia e economia pelo Magdalen College em Oxford. Concluiu seu PhD em política pela Universidade de Princeton. No período de 1995 até 2009, ela fez parte do corpo docente do Instituto Hubert H. Humphrey de Relações Públicas da University of Minnesota, onde também dirigiu o Centro sobre Mulheres e Políticas Públicas. Hoje, doutora Kenney é professora do Departamento de Ciência Política da Tulane University, ocupando a cátedra de Newcomb e diretora do Instituto Newcomb também. Ela é professora afiliada da Faculdade de Direito. Dentre os muitos livros e artigos publicados, um título de destaque é o livro publicado em 2013, Gênero e Justiça, porque as mulheres no Judiciário realmente são importantes. Gender and Justice, Why Women in the Judiciary Really Matter. Doutora Kenney, seja bem-vinda. A palavra é sua. Welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really kind introduction. I am so thrilled to be speaking to this group of people, even though I'm ashamed that I'm not able to address you in Portuguese. I did have the great privilege of attending the International Association of Women Judges meeting in London in 2012, and I heard Judge Amini Haddad Campos and Judge Adriana Cunningham speak about their report on the Maria de Pena law. And I was blown away by how fabulous the 20 Brazilian women delegates were to that conference. And my colleague, Colin Crawford here, who's now the Dean of the Law School of the Golden Gate Law School in California, has been telling me for years that I need to pay more attention to all the great things that are going on led by women judges in Brazil. So I'm so great to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about some of my work. Yesterday was my birthday. And so since I work on women judges, I get a lot of judge-themed presents. And so you can see this birthday card I got from my husband. It says, "Happy birthday, may you live forever," with Justice Ginsburg on the front. And of course, I have various Justice Ginsburg themed masks to protect me from COVID. Here's one with her face on it. And my favorite thing, I think, is the judge mints that I have from Justice Ginsburg, and just kind of shows you what an icon she's been. So let me see if I can manage to share my screen with you and proceed. So I want to talk a little bit today about how we carry forth Justice Ginsburg's legacy. And I know some of you who are really, really interested in Justice Ginsburg may have watched a plug-in podcast I did after the documentary and the feature film about her came out. And I talked about what was in there, what wasn't in there, what things I might have chose to emphasize differently. So that's all available to you if you're interested in digging deeper. I also recommend this book about both of the justices, which is very readable. And historian Jane DeHart has just released this very lengthy and comprehensive biography that she's been working on for years. And Mary Hartnett, who's also from my home state of Iowa, is Justice Ginsburg's official biographer. And I expect her to have a biography out shortly. But she's also, they decided to, before she did that, publish some of her selected writings that are available. So I've been working with women judges for a while, and you can see me here. I helped to organize our little conference here in New Orleans for our national group. And you'll notice the NAWJ logo behind me. And this is a copy of the cover of my book. You'll notice behind Justice Ginsburg is that same logo. And Justice Ginsburg has been an active member of the national and international groups for ages. And I had the great opportunity to talk with her in 2013 when she was the keynote speaker for a conference in San Diego. You can see this is my head in the front there, the curly hair with the gray suit, listening to her. And one of the things I wanted to share with you that I learned by talking to her at dinner that night at the conference is that contrary to what we know about her, which was really her focus on equal employment discrimination cases, she considered her greatest contribution to be the work that she did to get rid of sex and race discrimination against people who were potential jurors. And those cases came out of a case that she argued, Healy versus Louisiana. And ultimately in 1979, one of the last gender-based classifications that the Supreme Court struck down in Taylor, Louisiana, came out of the work that she did in Louisiana to strike down gender and race-based discrimination against women jurors. And the jury cases were really interesting for women's rights advocates because women's rights advocates disagreed about what was wrong with the exclusion of women from juries. Was it because women were the same as men? And so because they were just as capable of rational decision-making and setting aside their biases and emotions as men, it was unfair to exclude them. It was a violation of their citizenship rights. Or was the harm that women were different from men such that litigants before the court did not receive a fair cross-section and a jury of their peers? And the great thing about the jury cases is that feminists didn't have to agree. They could say, well, whatever your justification is, we can agree that it's a bad idea to exclude women. And I think that same parallel holds for making arguments about women judges. I take the position, as Justice Ginsburg did, that we make the best arguments when we don't focus on women's difference, but we make equality-based arguments for women's inclusion. And the reason for that is that most sex differences, to the extent that they exist at all, are overlapping, right? And even if you think about height, or speed, the fastest man may be faster than the fastest woman, but the fastest woman is faster than almost all the men. So what happens is, even when we find so-called real sex differences, maybe some people, women are better at getting children to stop crying and go to sleep. It's a slight difference, and there's a lot of overlap. But as soon as we recognize a sex difference, we tend to talk about it in this, what we would call an essentialist way, that all men are this and all women are that. And so it creates a distortion. And we know from social psychologists that whenever we notice a difference, so if you pick a group of people and say, you're the blue team and you're the green team, pretty soon the green team will be saying, well, we're the smart team and you're the slow team. And the blue team will start saying, we're the fun team and you're the boring team. And we start manufacturing these differences. And once we start manufacturing differences, they oftentimes develop a hierarchy that the green team is better than the blue team. And it seems to be not inevitable, but a very common practice in just how human cognition works. So I would argue that if we want to say why we need more women judges, these are the arguments I find the most persuasive. We should use all our available talent. We don't have to say what the harm of exclusion is. So when women were given the vote, or women won the vote is probably a better way of saying it, we don't have to say, well, women tend to agree with their husbands, so there's no harm of excluding them. Same thing with juries. Even though women may have decided the case is the same, it's still not okay to exclude them. We often make, in federal systems like the US and Brazil, or in international bodies, why we have to have a judge from Luxembourg on the European Court of Justice, but we don't sort of say Luxembourg judges speak in a different voice and decide cases differently. It's important that litigants before the court see themselves represented. So it's not just important that justice is done, but that justice is seen to be done. And for those, I think now in 2021, anyone who argues that we shouldn't have parity on every decision-making body in a representative democracy should have to say why it's okay to disproportionately exclude them. And whenever we see a representation that's different from the qualified labor pool, so 50% of women get their PhDs in political science, but the Tulane political science department only hires 25% women, we tend to say, I wonder if there's something wrong with our selection process, such that we're not being fair to all comers. And if you set up any system of true merit, whether it's examination or whatever, rather than cronyism, which is really the way we've picked federal judges in the United States since the founding. And there's always a joke is that a judge is a lawyer who knows a senator. And it's just funny how the best qualified people for the federal bench just happen to be the congressman's roommate in college. So if we set up a system of true merit, women participate well. And so we can look to the example of the International Criminal Court, where they said, yes, we want women on the bench, but we also want those people who have experience with gender-based violence, which is why the criminal court was set up in the first place. And say, for example, the European Court of Human Rights has made a rule that when a country submits a short list, it should have a name of at least one woman on it, even though, for example, Malta said, you know what, we can't find one woman in all of Malta who we think might be qualified for this position. This is a sort of a quote from Justice Ginsburg, as she used to always try to get people thinking when they would say, well, how many do we need on the court in order to have a representative and fair court? And she would say 9, because we've had 9 men since the beginning. So let's do the next 200 years with 9 women. In her later years, however, Justice Ginsburg shifted somewhat and became slightly less of a fierce defender of equality and recognized that it really did make a difference. And she did bring what she called a distinct medley of views to the bench. And in particular, she would use the example of a case of a 13-year-old girl who was strip searched by her school nurse because they suspected she might be carrying the harmful drug of Advil illegally in her school. They found no drugs on her, but she was really affected and traumatized by the experience. And Justice Ginsburg says, my colleagues just don't know what it's like to be a 13-year-old girl. So as we think about Justice Ginsburg's passing, I would like to draw a comparison with another judicial icon who left the bench in 2020, and that was Chief Justice Baroness Brenda Hale of the United Kingdom. And what was important in my view about both Justice Ginsburg and Chief Justice Hale is that they were not just women. They were feminist legal scholars and feminist activists, and perhaps the leading feminist scholars of their generation. And so when we think about how the Supreme Court has changed, and we think about Justice Amy Coney Barrett, we have to recognize that women are not interchangeable, just as men are not, and they are very different from each other. And we've really lost that voice on the court of this sort of feminist legal scholar and strategist. So I was asked by the group to not speak only about Justice Ginsburg's legacy, but the broader issue about how we can make more progress on the bench. And I was delighted to read the Jufe report, which really reminded me of the gender bias task forces that many courts in the United States did in the 1990s. A sociologist, Virginia Valian, wrote a book pulling forth the data across many different spheres of education, employment, citizenship, et cetera, and asking, why aren't we making more swift progress towards women's equality? And the first thing, of course, to recognize is, even though in the introduction it was noted that women lawyers are on the rise, there's nothing inevitable about those numbers translating into women's greater representation in the judiciary. And we also fall into the false view that we'll just continue to make steady progress, and that is also not true. So we can see the case where women leaders, like in my home state of Iowa, were replaced by men and the state reverted to the bench being all male. One of the things that really pierced my heart that Valian found when she interviewed young girls who loved to play soccer and who were really good at it is they said, well, we quit because the boys don't pass us the ball, and when we score, they don't cheer. And that really resonated with me as an academic. And also, I think it's really consistent with some things found in some of the research by a colleague I just discovered recently. I hope I don't massacre her name. Rafaele Carvalho, who was looking at some of the differences in reporting judges and behavior on the Brazilian Supreme Court. So it's important to remember that important symbolic victories, as it was a very important milestone in the United States, can mask other setbacks. So even though President Reagan got enormous credit for appointing the first woman to the US Supreme Court, that appointment actually concealed the fact that overall his appointments fell by half from what his predecessors, President Carter's, were. So while he got credit for Justice O'Connor, we actually went backwards. And that pattern has been continued with every president, including President Trump. Republican presidents tend to appoint judges, women judges and diverse judges at about half the rate of Democratic presidents. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept, whether we call it a backlash or a counter movement. It's a very interesting idea, but I want to disabuse us of this idea that our progress is steady and inevitable. And when women first started getting appointment to judicial office, we thought that, you know, kind of like the state under communism, that it would magically, opposition to women would wither away. And we haven't seen that. And many of us are questioning whether, in fact, the opposition to women's advancement gets stronger the more women advance. So I want to talk about this. And when I was a brand new assistant professor, I had this on my wall at the University of Iowa that had never tenured a woman political scientist. And it was attributed to Margaret Mead's daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson. And I think many women first can attest to this idea that it's not an easy position to be in, however well they do it. And in my book, I use the idea of backlash to analyze what happened to the first woman Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Rose Bird. She was actually removed from office in a judicial retention election. And so now I've been thinking about applying those same arguments I made in Rose Bird's case to thinking a little bit about Justice Ginsburg's experience. So the first example would be treating men and women very differently in the judicial selection process. And that's what Carvalho has written about, the questions that people tend to get asked, like Justice Sotomayor was asked about why she doesn't have children and what's the nature of her diabetes and why did she get a divorce, that sort of thing. And although we didn't see much of that with Justice Ginsburg, there were some elements that are there, and that really reflects what we call implicit bias. And we see it most clearly, I think, in the orchestra tryouts. And so people were saying, well, why is it that so few women would be in orchestras? Because nobody cares what one's gender identity is. One just cares with how you play the cello. But we found that when you study it, actually, when the music is being made by a woman's body, the listeners just don't find it to be quite as sweet. And so when women tried out from behind a barrier and took off their shoes so that no one would wonder whether the stiletto sounds coming in were suggested a woman player, that women's numbers rose incredibly. And so I think we can learn a lot by educating all of us about implicit bias and how we devalue the sound of women musicians and other women's contributions. Justice Ginsburg was not discriminated against particularly for her Supreme Court appointment, but she was passed over for a district court appointment. And of course, she had the last laugh because even though the chair of the selection panel didn't select her because he wanted his buddy to get the district court position, she was then selected to be on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is really the primary feeder position for the US Supreme Court. So by virtue of being discriminated against for a district court position, she was actually in position to become a Supreme Court justice. And one of the things that I think her husband deserves enormous credit for is that he was the one who really lobbied intensively for her judicial appointment. The second point is just denying sitting judges their positional power or professional courtesy. And I have this is one of my favorite calendars of my social justice cats. And a great example of that is really the first woman to serve on the circuit court bench in the United States, Florence Allen. She had been elected to the state Supreme Court in Ohio, and every day her colleagues lunched at a male-only club where she was not allowed to join them. And we see some example of that here in a case of Justice Alito rolling his eyes at Justice Ginsburg as she read one of her dissenting opinions from the bench. And I think you'll get a little kick out of this meme. This is her smoothing down his robe for a photograph. But people did not take kindly to his behavior. This is a funny New Yorker cartoon that I often, I think a lot of women can relate to. Justice Ginsburg did say that once Justice O'Connor left the bench, that she didn't feel that her colleagues listened to her anymore. And as you know, it wasn't because she was not a brilliant judge. A third example would be litigants and other people not giving women judges their due, either by calling them Mrs. O'Connor instead of Justice O'Connor, or confusing the women judges with each other as if they're interchangeable. And we know that the research shows that women judges, even in the Supreme Court, where they're elevated on a dais and they've got their robes on and there's strict rules, that those lawyers arguing before them interrupt the women justices with impunity. And I understand there's a study being done of that very phenomenon on the Brazilian Supreme Court. The other thing, of course, Justice Ginsburg did is she fiercely defended the judiciary as a whole, not just herself. And so when our former president called them so-called judges, these memes appeared. She did have one kind of breach of this judicial etiquette herself, in that she was really not a fan of President Trump, and she called him a faker. But she apologized. The other example I would use for backlash is when there's a double standard and things that women justices do are judged more harshly than things that men judges do. So for example, speaking out. So this was a meme when President Trump threatened the courts if they didn't decide the way he wanted. And I kind of like this because it captures the fact that Justice Ginsburg was always impeccably turned out with, the perfect earrings for the occasion. Another example would be when women leave the bench, replacing them with men, suggesting that it's not important to have a representative judiciary. And here's a funny little meme of the look on Justice Ginsburg's face at Justice Kavanaugh's swearing in, which was a really difficult day for many of us, including Justice Ginsburg, I suspect. The last example I would use would be the example we've seen recently of killing judges themselves, murdering them or their children, as in the case of Judge Salas, whose son was recently shot by a disgruntled anti-women's rights terrorist. I'm running out of time, so I want to move quickly. I was going to make a few points about leadership, but let me just say clearly, by the fact of organizing this event, the committee that so generously brought me in, the reports, the participation in IAWJ, I can see that Brazilian men and women judges are really carrying on the legacy of Justice Ginsburg by organizing to ensure that equal protection under the law is not just a promise, but a reality. And so the examples that I was going to use of the work that we've done in the United States have already really been taken to heart or superseded by your fabulous group there. And so I just want to conclude by saying how much I admire the work you're doing and how much I'd like to support it. And I would be happy to take any questions you have. And here's the last little meme I'll take of Justice Ginsburg and say, be strong.
Muito obrigado, doutora Kenny. É bem difícil para bater a palma em uma reunião virtual, mas eu vou fazer para todo mundo. Muito obrigado. Agora, muito obrigado.
The deaf people.
Sim, ótimo. Um tema fascinante e importante para os Estados Unidos e o mesmo para o Brasil também. Agora é meu prazer para se apresentar nossos participantes no debate. Dr. Roger Halp Rios, desembargador federal do Tribunal Regional Federal da Quarta Região, mestre e doutor em Direito pela Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul e é professor do programa de pós-graduação, mestrado e doutorado em Direito da Unicinos e na Enfant, autor de artigos e livros, entre os quais Direito da Antidiscriminação e uma defesa dos direitos sexuais. Também temos a doutora Jane Reis Gonçalves Pereira, professora de Direito Constitucional da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Estado do Rio de Janeiro, UERJ, e juíza federal, doutora em Direito Público pela UERJ e mestre em Direito Constitucional e Teoria do Estado pelo PUC-Rio. Ela também é fundadora e editora-chefe da revista Público. Doutora Jane, a palavra é sua.
Boa tarde a todos e todas. É uma satisfação enorme, uma honra participar desse evento, estar aqui para debater a participação das mulheres no Judiciário a partir dessa inspiradora exposição da professora Sally Kenny. Eu quero agradecer pela oportunidade à JUF, na pessoa do Eduardo André, à JUF Mulheres, na pessoa da Tani, ao Consulado dos Estados Unidos, na pessoa do Kevin e Carla. Quero enviar também uma saudação especial para o Roger e para toda a equipe responsável pela organização desse evento. A obra da professora Sally Kenny, ela tem sido uma referência central e importante para os trabalhos, para os estudos que eu fiz nos últimos anos sobre igualdade de gênero no Poder Judiciário. Esse livro que ela colocou, ela mostrou, né, e o Kevin também citou, Gênero e Justiça, porque Mulheres no Judiciário realmente importa, de 2012, além dele fornecer um panorama muito completo, muito detalhado, muito bem fundamentado a respeito da discussão sobre o problema da igualdade de gênero nas carreiras judiciárias, ele tem também um relato, né, uma exposição da própria trajetória da professora Sally Kenny como especialista na matéria. Então, essa combinação entre uma pesquisa rigorosa e esse compartilhamento das experiências biográficas me marcaram muito. É um livro muito importante para mim. Eu quero dar uma pequena contribuição, muito breve, comentando alguns dados a respeito da participação de mulheres no judiciário no Brasil, dialogando rapidamente com pontos que a professora Sally Kenny expôs na sua fala. Os dados que nós temos hoje, eles são de um censo realizado pelo Conselho Nacional de Justiça em 2014, e da própria a JUF, que elaborou, como o Eduardo mencionou no início, 2 notas técnicas sobre o assunto. Então, no Brasil, nós temos hoje 55% de mulheres saindo das faculdades de Direito. E na carreira judiciária, são 38% em escala nacional, apenas 26% no plano federal, lembrando que a carreira da magistratura federal é uma carreira relativamente nova, porque ela se organiza de forma mais ampliada e passa a ter concursos públicos a partir da Constituição de 88, e entre 15% e 17% nos tribunais superiores. É interessante notar que nós temos 42% de juízas substitutas e 21% na segunda instância. Então, existe esse mecanismo de fechamento que a professora Sally Kane comentou, né, até mesmo em relação a outras carreiras, como a carreira docente, na carreira judiciária. E a JUF Mulheres fez um levantamento muito interessante sobre as promoções por mérito, que são, no sistema brasileiro, a seleção para a primeira instância é feita por concurso e o acesso aos tribunais alterna a promoção por tempo de serviço, por antiguidade, e a promoção por mérito, que envolve elementos com um aspecto mais subjetivos e políticos. E existe também uma diferença muito importante no acesso nessas hipóteses em que há menos elementos objetivos sendo aplicados para as promoções. E uma última coisa que me lembrei agora, quando a professora Sally Kane falava do backlash, ela falou do assassinato da juíza, né? Falou que esse assassinato muitas vezes se materializa sob a forma de violência, e houve no Brasil também, alguns anos atrás, um assassinato brutal de uma juíza, a juíza Patrícia Scioli, que também chocou o país, e enfim, que confirma também aqui, né, essa violência se materializa. Eu vou fazer, então, 2 perguntas para a professora Sally Kane. O ponto central da obra da professora Kane, do qual eu compartilho, é rejeitar uma visão essencialista a respeito do gênero para justificar a presença de mulheres no Poder Judiciário. Quer dizer, a presença de mulheres no Judiciário importa não porque as mulheres vão julgar melhor, ou porque vão julgar diferente, ou porque vão manifestar uma maior sensibilidade, ou porque elas tenham uma forma específica de votar, ou de falar, ou de olhar para os fatos. O que justifica, e a gente pode aplicar essa discussão também, a questão de raça, né, a questão de outras minorias que não estão incluídas nos órgãos de poder, é o fato de que as pessoas que se submetem ao exercício daquele poder, as pessoas que têm suas causas julgadas, devem sentir que seriam aptas a acessar aqueles cargos. Quer dizer, é uma questão de equivalência de status cívico, uma questão que envolve legitimidade democrática do judiciário, até a partir de um conceito mais simbólico de representação. Eu concordo plenamente com isso, com o fato de que o que justifica mais diversidade no judiciário não é a ideia de que isso vai necessariamente produzir julgamentos melhores, julgamentos mais bem elaborados. Mas ainda assim, e aí vem a minha pergunta, um aspecto que me intriga é o quanto a diversidade pode interferir. A professora chegou a falar um pouco disso, ao falar das cortes criminais, em determinadas questões sensíveis, ou seja, em questões que envolvem violência de gênero, como no caso, né, da menina que sofreu a busca. Recentemente, na Índia, algumas semanas atrás, há uma enorme comoção em torno do fato de um juiz muito experiente, com 20 anos de carreira, ter afirmado que ter perguntado a um estuprador se ele se casaria com a vítima como uma forma de resolver a situação. Isso deflagrou lá também um debate sobre a baixa diversidade. E eu lembro de uma frase da juíza Ruth Ginsburg em Hobby Lobby, um julgamento em que se negou acesso a métodos contraceptivos de empregadas de empresas controladas por religiosos que objetavam o uso de métodos contraceptivos, em que ela disse que os juízes homens não compreendem o que Hobby Lobby significou para as mulheres. Então, a minha pergunta, a minha primeira pergunta teria a ver com essa questão, né? Partindo da premissa de que não há uma diferença essencial, como justificar nessas questões sensíveis, nessas questões mais delicadas, em que o gênero pode ter um peso grande, a necessidade de composições mais plurais no judiciário? A minha outra pergunta tem a ver com design, com arquitetura institucional. A professora falou bastante sobre os preconceitos implícitos e um questionamento que se coloca no Brasil, e a JUF Mulheres, a associação também trabalhou nisso, é a questão dos comitês de seleção, né? Há também uma baixíssima representatividade de mulheres nos comitês de seleção. Então, eu gostaria de ouvir a professora se ela acredita que reformas de desenho institucional, nudges, né, como se chamam hoje no campo da economia comportamental, algumas formulações poderiam auxiliar ou poderiam diminuir esses preconceitos implícitos. Eu lembro de uma autora, Iris Bonet, que ela fala até mesmo daquelas paredes com os quadros, com as representações, né, dos presidentes ou dos juízes, ou enfim, ou em qualquer outro campo, né, em que há poder dos antigos ocupantes dos postos de poder, que poderiam desincentivar as mulheres a se candidatar para aquelas posições. Então, essa minha contribuição, são essas duas perguntas que eu estou muito curiosa para ouvir a professora Sally Kane, agradecer a exposição. Fiquei muito curiosa em relação aos slides que passaram rapidamente. Gostaria de ter ouvido mais. Muito obrigada.
Are we taking all the questions first before I answer? Is that the plan?
Bom, pode ser, então, a palavra pode passar para o Dr. Roger Ralph.
Dr. Kenny, I think you can go ahead and answer this question, and then we'll go to Dr. Hosier to have his contextual thoughts as well.
Well, thank you for those really profound and thoughtful questions. And I'm so thrilled to know about you and your work. And I'm looking forward to learning more about what's going on in Brazil. I think you've really captured the complexity of the issue in your question, because it's subject to misinterpretation, but there's a really interesting set of folks working on what they call feminist judgment projects. So we finally had the one in the US, but I think they started in the UK and Australia. Canada's done them, Northern Ireland's done them, maybe even New Zealand. And what they do is get a group of scholars together and they take one of these questions, as you suggest, where it's a case that really is inflected by gender. And they talk about what would constitute a feminist judgment of that case, and then really debate it and write kind of an alternative judgment. And it really brings home the point that, we don't pop out of the womb understanding, maybe why boys shouldn't be with fathers who are batterers, because that puts women at risk. Maybe some women get to that point more quickly than men, maybe not. But it's a really a state of consciousness, and it's a real expertise to think about this. Not all women necessarily understand the dynamics of violence against women. They have to learn about it. They can learn about it in part from their own experience, but they can learn about it as an area of expertise. And that's, I think, where the example of the criminal court is a good one, is that it's not just enough to have, you know, these bodies. You have to have men and women and transgender people who really understand the complexities of these issues and can bring that voice forward. So I think you really captured exactly the answer to your question in the thoughtfulness in the way you've raised the question. And the second thing I think is my position also, like the first question you asked, puts me at odds with a lot of people, that we should favor a certain kind of selection system. Like Justice O'Connor was very much in favor of what she calls so-called merit selection, which is just let the lawyers and judges decide because they know best. They don't know best. They haven't produced a diverse and representative judiciary whenever they've been in charge of it. In the federal system in the United States, if you let judges pick, as they do magistrate judges, they pick judges at half the diversity rate as other selection systems, right? Any selection system can produce a diverse and representative bench, and any selection system can prevent it. The only thing that produces it, as is the case, for example, in Ontario or with President Carter's commission, is to say what the Brennan Center found is that you have to train people on implicit bias, and you have to set non-discrimination as a goal, and the goal that you're going to get a diverse and representative judiciary. So in the case of the UK, when you change the selection system from what they call secret soundings, where the Lord Chancellor calls around and says, hey, is so-and-so a good chap? And then the guy says, yeah, he's a good chap. Then they get picked. Or the US example where the senator says, hey, brother-in-law, law partner, college roommate, I think you'd make a great judge. And then they say, yeah, you'd make a great judge. I think you'll be our federal jurist. We can actually say, what are we looking for in a judge, and who can, and so, you know, even in an application system, you know, everybody knows when the job is rigged and they're not going to pick women and minority men, women don't apply. But when you say, hey, we really want to do this, you can do it. So what the Brennan Center found in its report is that you have to have the selection panel be recruiters and trained on implicit bias, not just be what's called vetters that sit back and say, oh, magically, we're going to have this result without having to try.
Eu acho que temos que dar uma oportunidade para o senhor Roger também para fazer.
Muito boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todos. Inicio cumprimentando e agradecendo a nossa convidada, professora Sally, agradecendo pela sua intervenção, assim como a reação às perguntas da Jane. Quero também cumprimentar meus colegas da JUF Mulheres, a Tani, Eduardo André, pelo consulado americano também o Sr. Kevin Brosnahan. É um privilégio estar aqui neste momento. Como magistrado homem, sou integrante do grupo JUF Mulheres e inicio afirmando a certeza de que a injustiça de gênero é fundamental para o judiciário e a sociedade brasileira como um todo, muito mais do que um tema restrito a mulheres. Minha contribuição, na linha do que fez a professora Jane, será mais restrita a algumas perguntas, algumas delas no sentido daquelas já feitas e outras relacionadas às perguntas da professora Jane, mas com outra ênfase. Peço a gentileza da professora Sally para, no meio dessas perguntas, selecionar aquelas que lhe parecem mais pertinentes. A primeira delas, professora, em que intensidade média, alta, muito intensa, a senhora qualificaria o ethos prevalente no judiciário estadunidense em relação ao sexismo e à discriminação de gênero? Uma outra pergunta, já falando da situação brasileira. No caso brasileiro, eu não teria dúvida em qualificar o nosso sistema judicial nacional como bastante sexista, seja em virtude da mentalidade prevalente entre seus membros, seja em face do conteúdo de muitas decisões judiciais, onde não há atenção às dinâmicas discriminatórias que envolvem o gênero. Esta realidade, a meu ver, coloca uma questão fundamental. É possível que instituições de justiça, intrinsecamente contaminadas por sexismo, insensíveis à discriminação por gênero, atuem de modo justo e com equidade diante da sociedade? Ainda com relação às questões de gênero, no direito estadunidense, em especial nos debates que perpassam as cortes judiciais. Na sua avaliação, até que ponto as questões do feminismo negro, da interseccionalidade, se apresentam nos debates das cortes judiciais estadunidenses? Por fim, eu gostaria de lhe perguntar também, especificamente quanto à carreira judicial da juíza Ruth Ginsburg. Em que a senhora distinguiria a carreira dessa juíza, se comparada a outras juízas, não só da Suprema Corte, mas juízas de destaque no cenário judiciário estadunidense? No que se distingue a carreira da juíza Ruth Ginsburg, se comparada à carreira de outras juízas nos Estados Unidos, em particular na Suprema Corte? Muito obrigado e fico ansioso por ouvir as suas considerações.
These are really great questions. So it may not surprise you as a passionate feminist that I am very critical about the American judiciary. And I'm also very pessimistic. I believe our judicial selection system is completely broken. And I'm curious about what's going to happen in the next 4 years, but I am very unhappy. And particularly over the last 10 years, I've been working a lot on sexual violence and rape, and trying to make alternatives to criminal justice, whether they're using equality law under Title IX on campus, grievance procedures. And I've kind of gotten to the point that Justice Blackmun famously said, which is, I will no longer tinker with the machinery of death. I feel like for sexual violence, I will no longer tinker with judicial processes and try to make them work for sexual assault victims. So I think when it comes to these entrenched ideas that women are liars, that sexual harassment does no harm, I believe we've really gone backwards in a lot of ways in employment discrimination laws in the US. I have my red jacket on today because today is Equal Pay Day. So this is how long American white women have to work in order to earn the same as their male compatriots, because we've made no progress on equal pay over the last 40 years. And then to go to your next question in intersectionality, of course, women of color have to work even longer than white women to make up that pay gap. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, I think, right now is that, and I think is really interesting about President Obama's appointments to the federal bench is that he really looked for African-American women, Latina women, openly gay and lesbian judges, appointed the first Native American judge in American history. So he's diversifying the bench in a much deeper way than is with respect to gender. And that's kind of one of the interesting puzzles to me about Ruth Bader Ginsburg becoming such a sort of a rock star with younger women, because Justice Ginsburg was really not a big proponent of an intersectional approach. She did not focus on issues of gender-based violence and sexual violence. She really focused on citizenship and employment. She was not the justice who had the most racially diverse group of law clerks even though she was criticized for that many times. But I think what was really distinctive about Justice Ginsburg was that she was, again, that she was this really leading feminist intellectual. I mean, she was the leading feminist theorist. And so if you think of other justices like that worldwide, Albie Sachs in South Africa, I mean, I would consider him as a man to be kind of one of the leading feminist judges of all times. I would say the same thing about Justice Marshall. So that men, and non-gender binary people can be feminist leading thinkers and understand things, that it's not just tied to one's sex identity. Justice Ginsburg was, she was a white woman, she was Jewish, but she was from a very elite background if we look at her education. She married into a family that became very affluent, and she moved in very affluent legal circles. Now, it didn't protect her from anti-Semitism, it didn't protect her from sexism, but it protected her, but she did have, she went to an Ivy League law school. She moved in those circles, particularly later in life. So, but I would say what's distinctive about her really was her coming out of being a social justice litigator. So she crafted the legal strategy of the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And then she brought that strategic acumen to the bench. And that gave her the strength to dissent. And it made her really a social justice warrior, and made her fearless and not cautious. And so I think that's what I think most resonates across the generations about what we've lost. But you see that same thing. I mean, Albie Sachs was the same way. One of my heroes, who's just been unfortunately embroiled in a sexual harassment scandal in the UK, was such an advocate for race and gender equality on European community law, as we called it then, European Union law. So Lord Leicester. Many people can take up this mantle, and we hope that everybody will be inspired and we don't leave this work just to the women judges.
Thank you.
Eu posso, então, agora apresentar uma das perguntas, Kevin?
Sim, acho que temos alguns na caixa.
Sim, temos uma aqui. Vou ler, então. Pode ser? Essa pergunta, ela foi formulada por Veridiana Campos, que é doutora em Sociologia, pesquisadora da Fundação Carlos Chagas, tem um livro sobre o processo de feminização da magistratura no Brasil e produziu com a JUF a segunda nota técnica a respeito da participação feminina no Judiciário Federal. A pergunta da Veridiana é a seguinte: quando pensamos em espaços de poder, de um modo geral, iniciativas como a JUF Mulheres, nas quais as mulheres enfrentam de maneira institucionalizada o problema da desigualdade de gênero, são raras. Gostaria de ouvir a professora Sally Kenney falar sobre o que ela acredita que sejam as condições que ajudam, ou não, nesse tipo de formação, considerando que o termo feminista tende a ser muito mal visto em diversos espaços, especialmente no Judiciário, que trabalha com um pseudo-ideal de neutralidade.
Thank you. I'm reminded of Madeleine Albright's comment. She says, women do things, but they don't stay done. I guess it's sort of like housework. So she talked about when she was at the UN, trying to include women, make sure that women were in negotiations on peace processes and constitutional reform. And I think what's happened is that there's been a lot of what we would call reinventing the wheel, in that what we see in the United States is women would organize to press for more women judicial appointments, and then they would get a president elected who would be sympathetic to them, and then they would disband, and then they would have to start all over again when things started getting bad again. And so you saw that sort of up and down movement. But there's been lots and lots of great work like Ajufi. And it was really going on in the 80s and 90s in the United States, and very, very conservative lawmakers, including my own senator from Iowa, worked to try to shut it down because the kind of reports that they were producing were really damning, showing mistreatment of women litigants. We've also had a huge speaking out about judges who are sexually harassing their clerks recently as part of the Me Too movement. And none of these judges would have spoken out before, because being linked to a powerful judge, it's a feudal system. You benefit so much from being in that person's favor and being linked to that person, that speaking out against such a person, as Anita Hill discovered, is committing professional suicide. So I think all of these organizing efforts, the sort of thing that you're doing is really fabulous. But we keep doing them over and over and over again. And so, for example, when we started working on this in Minnesota in about 20 years ago, we created this project that I was going to talk about at the end of my slides called the Infinity Project. And maybe, anyway, we have appellate courts in the United States, and their composition was really invisible. So there'd only ever been one woman on the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which was the 7 states where I lived at the time: Iowa, Minnesota, and the others. The judge, Diana Murphy, who was on that, we took the name Infinity because it was the 8th for the 8th Circuit on its side. But Judge Murphy, who was the only woman on the 8th Circuit, accused us of naming it the Infinity Project because it would take until infinity to create equality for women in the bench. And now we have one more women on the 8th Circuit after all of our efforts. But there are women who are working worldwide. There are amazing judicial activists in Cairo and Egypt trying to get their constitutional provision enforced that women can't be excluded from judicial office, having to overcome the other judges' resistance. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this program. It's so exciting that my country is back in the diplomacy business after a 4-year hiatus. And so maybe, the United States will start to be a leader. The United UN Women, led, by an Argentinian for a time, has been starting to really collect the data and has a project on constitutions. Obviously, the International Association of Women Judges and the National Association of Women Judges have been doing great work. But like you say, what happens is some groups, either they work for a while and then they either succeed a little bit or get frustrated and tired, or there's a group like what happened in the United States where conservative members of the US Senate sort of said, oh, if you're a member of the National Association of Women Judges, if you call yourself a feminist, you know, that shows you're biased. And that's what happened to Justice Sotomayor when she was part of her confirmation hearings. You know, she said a wise Latina judge might make a better decision than a group of white men. And she was openly attacked, and many senators voted against her for her bias of saying that gender and race matter. So, you know, these are really difficult challenges, but I think, you know, I would just encourage all of you that are doing this work, those that are working, you know, there's a number of judges that are really working around racial diversity, sexual orientation diversity, in Australia, you know, in, you know, Morocco, you know, there's lots of people doing this work. And, you know, this kind of vehicle that we have today shows that, you know, we can hopefully use technology to, you know, maybe learn more from each other about, you know, strategies and things. But, you know, it's very difficult work. It doesn't happen by itself. It only happens because people get together and push, and you're doing all the right things. So don't lose heart. And you give me heart. I lose heart all the time about the American judiciary. And then people say, you know, then somebody calls me from Rio and says, oh, we want to talk to you, you know, and that inspires me.
Professora Sally, gostaria de lhe encaminhar mais duas perguntas. A primeira da nossa colega Jusa Federal Tani, liderança da JUF Mulheres. A pergunta é a seguinte: o Brasil é um país cuja maioria da população é negra, mas os números da participação de juízes negros, particularmente de juízas negras, os números são muito, muito baixos. Qual a diferença para o resultado da jurisdição quando há maior diversidade entre os membros do Judiciário, especialmente na área criminal, onde a maioria dos acusados são pessoas negras? E uma outra pergunta, esta na linha do que a senhora vem falando nesse nosso encontro, um tanto provocativa, de uma forma construtiva. O que é mais urgente quando pensamos em enfrentar a injustiça de gênero? Mais feminismo ou mais mulheres nos cargos da magistratura, sabendo, claro, que uma alternativa não exclui a outra? Muito obrigado.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be asked that question. Let me just start with the second question first. So in my book, I managed to be unpopular with virtually everyone because I argue that we have to have both. And so I would say it's not okay for conservatives to only appoint men. So in that respect, I'm glad that finally President Trump noticed that there are women conservatives out there too. And so it's not okay if you're appointing only conservative judges to only pick men, right? That's still discrimination, right? But at the same time, Amy Coney Barrett is no Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? So I believe sex and race and other forms of discrimination is wrong, even if it's Republican women, even if it's conservative women, that they shouldn't be discriminated against either. But we shouldn't confuse people's identity with their viewpoint. Just because it often coalesces, it's not the same thing. So we really have to advocate for both. And I believe that both are important because I think we need to normalize that women can hold power and can exercise justice. And it's very symbolic when women are excluded altogether. So I'm glad Justice Amy Coney Barrett is on the court for that reason. I think it's better that she's there than people look up and see only men, because the message that an all-male bench sends is a terrible message to society. Now, with respect to, the race issue is at least as hard as the sex issue, if not harder. And in my own state of Louisiana, we had our first ever African-American Chief Justice. And this is the state of Plessy versus Ferguson. You know, this is the old Confederacy. This is the place where, you know, this is the center of chattel slavery in the American South. Right? This is where the expression soul down the river comes from. It was New Orleans. And for us to have our first African-American Chief Justice, but she had a terrible fight, even though we have a system, which I think is your system, that the most senior judge becomes the Chief Justice. Even though she was the most senior judge, it was a big fight for her to get her position. And race very much matters in justice in Louisiana, because jurors who are African American are more skeptical of the police. And there's a lot of good reason for that. So I think that's why I really welcomed President Obama's strategy, is to not just, you know, I think what we don't want to do is see diversity as a zero-sum game, you know, so are you going to get an African American or are you going to get a woman? So one of the things President Obama did is appoint a number of African American women to the bench. But he sort of really looked for people who, you know, were diverse in multiple ways. And all of those ways are important for the reasons I've outlined. But as we see in the United States, you know, you can have an African-American justice on the bench, and Justice Thomas is the most critical justice of a racial equality agenda. So there's no necessary connection between having an African-American judge and that they will represent greater equal justice under law. So we really need to look at what is their background. And that's one of the things that was interesting. It was funny because President Carter only required this of his women judges, but every woman judge he appointed had to have demonstrated already in her career a commitment to equal justice under law, whether she'd been a public defender, whether she had written reports like your Jufe reports, whether she had been involved in something like the Feminist Judgments Project, right? He didn't require that of the men he appointed or the African-American men he appointed, but he wanted every woman to be basically a feminist. So I believe it's legitimate to ask everyone. And I know that the struggles you have are very similar to the struggles that the Kenyan judges have had, because historically, you know, the judges in Kenya remained either white or East African Asian. And so there's a constitutional provision in the Kenyan constitution that a third of the justices on the Supreme Court have to be women, but there's no provision that they have to be African. And so it's really been an uphill battle to create that diverse judiciary, a judiciary that looks like Kenya. And we do not have a judiciary that looks like America. And, you know, it sounds like you have a lot of work to do too, but I think it's always both and we need to work on those at the same time. And I would never be, I think a racially diverse bench is every bit as important as a gender diverse bench. would be my argument. And that's kind of where my work was going as I stopped to kind of become an administrator, is to really look at what we call intersectionality. How as, for example, like our Chief Justice, how was the discrimination she faced as an African-American woman different from the discrimination that white women face or African-American men? And it was very, very real. So we're really grappling with those issues too.
Thank you.
Eu acho que temos tempo para uma pergunta mais.
Temos mais uma pergunta.
Jane, você tem outra pergunta?
Sim, eu recebi aqui mais uma pergunta. Formulada por Simone Trento. Como podemos acelerar a participação feminina nos tribunais que dependem por promoção por desembargadores, que são juízes de segunda instância, na maioria homens, e nos superiores, que dependem da formação de listas pelos próprios tribunais, que são, em sua maioria, compostos por homens?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'd definitely be in a very different environment in academia in the United States. I can sort of say, I think you have to continue shining the spotlight on the results and hold people accountable for results. One of the things we did in political science is the American Political Science Association is probably one of the least democratic institutions on the planet. I mean, the Soviet Union's method of selections were far more democratic than the American political science election system. They had a nominating committee that would nominate a slate of candidates who were unopposed every year, and there was no election. That's how the American Political Science Association, who all of its leaders actually opposed women's suffrage, chose the leadership of the American Political Science Association. And surprise, surprise, only white men became presidents of the American Political Science Association. So I was in the Women's Caucus, and we organized year after year. And every year we would come up with fantastic women faculty who would be great candidates to lead the American Political Science Association. And every year, another man would be chosen instead of the woman. And so finally we said, okay, either you pick a woman or we're going to amend the Constitution of the American Political Science Association to say you can't have more than 2 people of the same sex in a row as president. So if you've had 2 men as president, then the only person who can be chosen next has to be a woman. And we went and made that proposal. And suddenly, rather than risk that constitutional amendment to the American Political Science Association, we started having about 1 in 3 women presidents of the American Political Science Association. And guess what? I mean, maybe Malta should come and study the American Political Science Association, because when you had to have women, it turns out that there were lots of great women candidates who could lead the American Political Science Association. So I think, you just have to use your creativity, but you're absolutely right that the game is rigged. The game is rigged. And unless we make a fuss and hold people accountable for results, we are going to be getting the same results. No matter how many women go to law school, no matter how brilliant women are on the bench, no matter how skilled they are administratively, it's not going to happen without somebody organizing to make it happen and the people in leadership choosing to make it happen. That's why I think it's so great that you all are so getting organized. So, but it's not going to happen by itself. Just like in my profession at a university, we have a year where, guess what? All of the alumni awardees just happen to be a man. And you can bet that the person who's the head of that selection committee is going to get a phone call from me every year when there's no women on that list. You know, and it gets really, really tiresome. But that's what it takes. And what happened too, we saw, for example, at the European Court of Justice, they could France had appointed one woman, and then Ireland appointed the first woman judge. Not the first woman was Advocate General. And then they kept saying, oh, you know, when the Scandinavian countries join, they have women. So we'll get some women judges then, as if the other Western European countries didn't have women judges who could be appointed. And then, of course, the Scandinavian countries joined and they didn't select any women. It was the formerly communist Eastern European countries that appointed the vast majority of women. But it was the law students who were coming to the court, and they would look at the panels and they would say, where are the women? How come there's no women? And then the, you know, information officer would say, well, that's really up to the member states and that's up to the council. But, you know, it takes like law students pressing people and the press. I wrote an article about how it was actually the legal correspondence in the UK. Every time they picked another person for the top appellate court in the UK, the legal correspondence would say, yet again, we have only men. So there are a lot of different folks, whether they're law students, whether they're journalists, whether they're other judges, whether they're legislators, whether they're interest groups, who can make it their priority to focus on who's on the bench and who, you know, and count. And it makes a difference.
Muito obrigado. Eu acho que nosso tempo está acabando. Quero agradecer todos os participantes, a JUF Mulheres, doutora Jane Reis, Dr. Roger Rapp Rios e o presidente do AJUF, Eduardo André, e especialmente nossa convidada, doutora Sally Kenny, para uma troca de ideias, um debate maravilhoso. Muito obrigado a todos vocês, os nossos participantes. E eu acho que esse é um bom começo de uma fala, uma conversa de um assunto muito importante. Muito obrigado e até breve. Tchau, tchau.